Absolute cost advantage of Adam Smith. David Hume wrote an essay of the balance of trade. He greatly influenced Adam Smith, and Smith wrote his famous book, The Wealth of Nations. And in that book, he gave importance to mercantile and maritime pursuits of nation. To Smith, trade is a consequence of human motives, the motive of the propensity to truck, to barter, to exchange one thing for another. There is a selfish motive in that because both the parties gain by this exchange of goods, the giver and the receiver. And that is how he relates it to trade. So both the parties entering into trade benefit from trade. Let's look at the idea of division of labor. Division of labor constitutes the basis of his theory of international trade. He says that this division of labor leads to improvement in the productive powers of labor, and therefore this specialization leads to production of more exchangeable goods, which has got higher value when the land and labor of the country are put together. So he believed that division of labor is the primary force that is a reason why countries enter into trade. This famous statement of Smith is relevant in this context. It is the maxim of every prudent master of a family never to attempt to make at home what it will cost him more to make than to buy. So, any prudent master of a family has to meet all the needs of the family, but then whether the family would like to produce everything at home or produce what it can produce at home and buy those things what it can't produce at the cheaper cost from outside. So, what is prudent in the conduct of every private family? He extends that argument and says that it can scarcely be a folly, can scarcely be a mistake for a country. So, no country will go wrong if it enters into trade because it does not have to produce everything that the country needs. He gives another important idea about trade and the cost of trading. He says it is possible to produce in Scotland good grapes by means of using technology like glasses, hotbeds, and hot walls. So, grapes can be grown in Scotland, and more than growing grapes in Scotland, it can also make very fine wine. But the catch of the situation is what will be the cost of producing wine in Scotland? Definitely, it will be 30 times more expensive than buying wine from some other country. So he asks this question: would it be a reasonable law to prohibit the importation of all foreign wines? Is it prudent to prevent the importation of wines from other country because those wines from other countries are cheaper? Is that better than encouraging the making of the wine claret and burgundy in Scotland? So Smith was very clear that if a country wants to produce everything, it may try to produce everything, but it can do so only at a prohibitive cost. So it is unwise for a country to think of producing everything when it can buy something cheaper from some other country. Let's come to this idea of absolute cost advantage. Smith believed that it is impossible for all nations to simultaneously become rich by following mercantilism. And he says that this specialization in the production of goods will be done by those countries which have got an absolute advantage in the production of some good. Then these goods will be traded with other goods. Now, Smith's theory essentially is what we have developed over time in the textbooks of international economics, because in his own writing we do not find the way in which we are explaining absolute cost advantage. It is an idea, and that idea is what we need to capture. That idea sets the ball rolling for the study of international economics. These assumptions are not laid out in the writings of Smith, but over time they have been included, and each book has its own set of assumptions. So here we find the assumptions are based on the principle of division of labor, which Smith, of course, believed in. And he talks about two countries, two commodities, and one factor model. This is why it is called a 2 into 1 factor model. So, two countries, two commodities, and one factor, that is labor. Then he says that then we assume that there is no transport cost between and within the country. This is just to make things easier and focus only on the cost of production. Then factors are mobile within the country but immobile between countries. That would mean if the labor can be taken from this country and used in other country, then the cost of production will change. So labor is one factor that can make the cost of production different. Of course, he was a proponent of free trade, and therefore we assume that countries will have trade without any barriers. Then there will be perfect competition in the market, and the opportunity cost of production is constant. And finally, the economy is operating in a condition of full employment. These are the assumptions which have been developed over time to explain the Smith's absolute cost advantage theory. Now, it is customary to explain absolute cost advantage with the help of a table. And in this table, you can see labor is the factor of production. There are two countries, A and B, and there are two commodities, X and Y. So we can take the example with 1 unit of labor. If we use 1 man-day of labor, then we can either produce 10 units of commodity X or 5 units of commodity Y in country A. That means 1 unit of commodity X can be equal to only zero point 0.5 units of commodity Y, half of it. In the second case, in country B, with 1 unit of labor, that country can produce only 1 unit of commodity X but 10 units of commodity Y. That means for every 1 unit of X, it can produce 2 units of commodity Y. Now the question is, will these two countries enter into trade? And if they enter into trade, what would they produce and exchange? So it is quite obvious from this that country A would rather produce good X because it can produce more good X than good Y, and good country B can produce more of good Y than good X. So the countries would specialize in the respective products, and that is how countries would get into trade. So absolute cost advantage is thus a scenario when one nation can produce the same amount of a good as another nation, but by using fewer resources or lesser resources. So if it is using lesser resources, then it is more efficient in the production of that commodity and specializes in the production of that commodity, and the other nation would do with the other commodity that the nation is good at. Example, we can see today that countries, the Middle East countries, have an absolute advantage in the production of petroleum products. We come to another term here, gains of trade. Between whatever places foreign trade is carried on, all of them derive two distinct benefits from that. What are the two distinct benefits from that? Each country will produce something more than what it requires, and there might be less demand of it than the amount available. And when this is given away to another country, it can bring in those commodities which the country does not have in large quantities to meet the needs of its own people. So, this is from Smith's writing itself. By doing this, what the country does is it gives away the superfluities, the extra goods that it has produced, the accompaniments of the goods that it has produced, which it doesn't require at home. So this can be actually gain. These goods can gain more value because by exchanging it with other countries, they attain the value, and also by bringing those other goods, it can satisfy those needs of the economy which cannot be met by their own production processes. So, exchange overproduction of goods, overproduced goods, with the other country. This came to be known as gains from trade. In some books, you find the word gains from trade, or there is a separate section for gains of trade, but it is essentially a continuation of the absolute cost advantage, and it is also known as when for surplus theory. It's the same thing. When for surplus, there has to be an opening for the surplus that the country has produced. That is why it is called the when for surplus theory, and it's not a separate theory, it is only a corollary to the main idea of Smith. So once we know this, the way Smith has written about international trade, we will understand that economics, being a social science, is dealing with ideas. Ideas about why countries enter into trade, ideas about what kind of goods will it produce, ideas about when it is exchanging, what is the basis of exchanging, and so on and so forth. So Smith gives us a background, a foundation for understanding the relationship that can exist between countries for trading. So, by opening a more extensive market for whatever part of the produce of the labor may exceed the home consumption, it encourages them to improve their productive powers. Once we find a vent of surplus, that means once we know that we can extend this surplus that we produce at home to other countries, then what can happen is we can improve the productive powers of the country, and it can increase the wealth of that nation. It can increase the real revenue of the nation. So went of surplus theory essentially is gains of trade, is nothing but the absolute cost advantage. It is the idea of surplus that needs to be produced but needs to be sold outside, because then a country can become rich. Now, what is that we can understand from Smith's absolute advantage theory? Smith's idea of international trade is thus closely interwoven with his theory of economic growth. There is no separate theory of economic growth as such, nor a theory of trade as such, but when we read the writings of Smith, we understand that all these ideas are connected to each other in a very beautiful way, where he tries to relate the nations becoming wealthy by trading with each other, and only then, when the nation is able to sell goods outside of itself, does a nation become rich. So it is about, Smith's ideas are about economic growth, it is about trade, it is about human motivation, it is about productive powers, it is about specialization, it is about division of labor. All of these ideas that Smith has, he has connected each of these ideas in such a way that we understand it as an absolute cost advantage. So this absolute cost advantage is available in textbook with the table and the assumptions, and of course with the criticism. So once we evaluate the theory, we can evaluate the assumptions that are written, of course, and the idea that trade takes place when it is free between nations, and whether it is good for a country to specialize in some commodity, and it could be potentially dangerous also for a country if it does not produce the other goods that it needs. It is also this theory is interestingly the forerunner for the next theory that I shall explain, which is the theory of comparative cost. So the theory of comparative cost is based on this theory of absolute cost advantage. Smith's starting point was division of labor rather than the static advantages, and he connected the economies of scale, the increasing returns of production, technological change, and productivity effort, all of them into one idea of absolute cost advantage. And he connects the trade with that of economic growth of a country. And finally, he talks about division of labor, which is central and reinforcing in this whole story of uh, the theory of absolute cost advantage. So I have a good reading for you, which I will present to you in the description box. And also for understanding Smith a little more, you may want to look at one of the earlier videos of this channel. And I hope that you will appreciate this video and you subscribe to this channel, because I shall be covering the almost all the topics that are required for the study of international economics. Thank you very much.